It is with great pleasure that I introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Evan Haefeli. Dr. Haefeli, a graduate of and former professor at Princeton University, is currently professor of colonial North American and Atlantic history at Texas A&M University. His many published works include New Netherland and the Dutch Origins of American Religious Liberty, Accidental Pluralism, America and the Religious Politics of English Expansion, and, with Kevin Sweeney, Captors and Captors, his 1704 French and Indian raid on Deerfield. Dr. Haefeli's presentation this evening on the Mohican Incorporation into the Iroquois League in the third corner of the 17th century highlights American Indian politics in New York in the age of Jacob Leisler. It will be of particular interest to us in the mid-Hudson River Valley, where the history of the peoples of Algonquian and Iroquois nations is receiving renewed attention. Dr. Haefeli.
Thank you very much, David, for the introduction, and thank you very much also to the library for hosting this event. It's a real pleasure to be here and to get a chance to talk to all of you about my work. I'll just say this is sort of part of ongoing scholarly work that I'm doing, which I have 3 articles on now. One just came out with the New England Quarterly last September. Another one is being considered by the Journal of New York History right now, and a third I need to revise just a little bit, and I'm going to send it out to the William and Mary Quarterly. So if anybody wants to get more specifics and details and scholarly citations from what you can look there. I'm going to speak in more general sort of terms here, pulling together a lot of that research to kind of answer this question or explain this this crucial piece of Mohican history, which nobody really remembers anymore. Partly because maybe they don't really want to remember it, but it's actually really very significant for understanding the history of New York in this period, the history of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, and also especially Mohican history. So when I say Mohican, I'm being deliberately a bit vague here. There's people use different terms to describe these people. Mohican with an H, with an AH instead of OH is one term people use, and that's mostly to describe the sort of the core group of Mohican peoples who lived around the Albany area. But I'm using Mohican because I'm talking about all the peoples who lived in the upper Hudson and upper Housatonic river valleys, who eventually get folded into what the modern Mohican nation is today. And I just say Mohican because the people I'm talking about, all or some of those people were involved in these events, and the documentary evidence is kind of sparse, so it's not always clear exactly which group of people from where were part of this, but these events touch on all of them and are relevant to all of them. So when I'm saying Mohican, I'm sort of talking about all of these peoples from the upper Hudson River Valley, sort of north of Kingston, and the people all the way and over to the Housatonic Valley, including the Stockbridge people. This is about a period in Mohican history that we don't know very much about. When scholars who write about Mohicans, we know a lot about the early 17th century history when they first meet the Dutch, and then we know about later on in the mid-18th century through the 19th century, when the mission is established in Stockbridge, and then Mohicans fight as allies of the Americans during the American Revolution. And then in the early 19th century, they're forced to move out west, ultimately to Wisconsin. But that middle earlier period from sort of the middle 17th century to the early 18th century um, has not been studied very much, and it's not entirely clear um, what's going on with these people. But actually, and hopefully you'll agree with me, after listening to this talk, I've come to believe that this is actually a really pivotal formative period in Mohican history, when sort of the modern version of the Mohican nation first comes together. For those of you who know a little bit more about this history, there's a couple of the key elements that I'll be addressing here are, first of all, the nature of the Mohican Confederacy. And there's scholars debate whether or not such a thing existed, and I'm basically saying that it did sort of exist, but not as people thought it did. The other thing is the fact the Mohicans did not fight in King Philip's War, which was this huge war that broke out between, many of you probably know about this, between the native people of New England against the English in New England in 1675, 1677, so right after the period that I'm talking about here. And all of those people were closely related to and connected to and allies with and friends with the Mohicans. So the fact that they didn't join with them in that war is a bit of a problem that needs to be explained, as you'll see when I get further on. This is also, obviously from the title, a lot about their connection to or their relationship with the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee, which is not something that gets talked about a whole lot, but is actually a really crucial piece of Mohican history. And I think finally, just as a shout out to the Leisler Institute, this is also helps explain why, when Leisler's rebellion does happen, the Mohicans do not play much of a role in it. It's really only the Iroquois Confederacy that does get involved with that event. The Mohicans are kind of in the background, and the story I'm going to tell here helps explain why that's the case. So this comes from research that I'm doing about the relations between not just the Mohicans and the Iroquois Confederacy, but the Iroquois Confederacy and all of the peoples living east of the Iroquois Confederacy, from New England down to Pennsylvania, basically, especially the Delaware Indians, or the Lenape. And in fact, it was by doing my research on the Lenape that I found some of the key evidence that helps me understand the story about the Mohicans. And one thing I should point out, though, is that we talk about the Delaware Nation and the Mohican Nation, which exists now and have existed for a while, but in the 17th century, especially before the 1670s, neither of those groups existed as a unified nation of sorts. They were based on shared language and culture. There's definitely a strong affinity, but basically people's attachment and loyalties was more to the village level, and there wasn't sort of a bigger national framework holding them together in the 17th century. That changes, and part of why that changes is the story I'm talking about here. The Mohicans' history is a little bit overlooked, I think. And what I found is, because they kind of, they're partly in New England, they're partly in New York, they have connections to Canada. And so to tell this story, I had to do research in archives in New York, New England, Pennsylvania, Canada, and in different languages: French, German, English, Dutch, as well as using a little bit of work with Native American linguistics. So it's been sort of a complicated process because there's not like a single archive or set of sources to use. And I've had to be very creative actually in finding sources to use to get at this history. And also in the methodology that I use, the way I use the sources. And that's and the key thing here is that uh, I'm using basic historical documents, from the 17th century, but the key evidence that I'm relying on is actually from Native American oral traditions that don't get written down until 100 or more years after the 17th century. So I'm using evidence that Native Americans have from their own oral histories, but that isn't recorded until the late 18th, the 19th, even the 20th century. So it's sort of a very wide range of different sorts of evidence. But using that kind of evidence is really crucial for figuring out this history, I believe. And it also helps me do what I want to do, which is write a more Indigenous-based or Indigenous-centered version of this history, these people's history, and not just sort of as an outsider or trying to make their history fit what we expect from sort of normal Western, European or American history. And in doing that, I find it very useful to try and use Indigenous concepts about politics and society. And here, kinship, their ideas about kinship are really, really crucial to understanding this. And we've known for a long time that, they talk about politics through the terms of kinship. They talk about, being brothers with each other, or they refer to their European allies as their father, for example. But historians haven't really fully understood what all of this means. I didn't even understand this until a year and a half ago when I had this eureka moment that made everything really click for me. And that's when I finally understood, the kinship term. One of the crucial key kinship terms here is uncle. The Mohicans refer to the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, as their uncles. But the other key piece of evidence for this history is another kinship term, namely grandfather. And that word, and understanding what that word means, is, you'll see, kind of the pivot of my analysis here. And so I'll talk more later on what those mean and how they all fit together. But I started out working with the Delaware, but I came to the Mohican story after reading some accounts that the famous Mohican leader named Hendrik Alpamat, who you might have heard, but he was one of the Stockbridge leaders. He was one of the guys who fought in the Revolution. He led the Mohican movement out west, very important guy. He also works for the United States a bit as a diplomat, going out west to the Great Lakes in the 1790s, trying to negotiate with Native American tribes there. And at some point he writes down a history of the Mohicans, and he talks a bit about his people's history and their connection to other Native nations in the area. And he talks a lot about all the different kinship terms that they use to refer to each other. So he talks about how all these different Native peoples, the Miamis, the Yandas, Potawatomis, the Shawnees, a whole bunch of other groups, are the younger brothers of the Mohicans, or the cousins of the Mohicans, or the grandchildren of the Mohicans. And he very proudly points out that many of these nations recognize the Mohicans as their grandfathers. Now, they're not older than any of these other people. It's a very specific honorific term, which he doesn't explain exactly what it means, nor does he explain um, why the term is used or when or how it got to be applied to these people. All he says is that it all dates back to something that happened about 200 years before he's writing his history. He's writing his histories around 1800, so that would mean he's talking about 1600. People could never really figure out exactly what he was talking about. They think that maybe this was a pre-colonial arrangement, that this is how relations were between all these people before Europeans arrived. But instead, what I'll show you today is that he's actually talking about the 17th century, and he's talking about the 1670s, this period that I'm going into in this talk. And what really clued me into that are two things. So first of all of these different nations that Hendrik Alpemaat talks about who look up to the Mohicans as grandfathers are peoples who were at war with the Iroquois Confederacy in the 17th century, as the Mohicans were as well for a time. And then the big exception are the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, who he points out are the uncles of the Mohicans. They're uncles. So the Mohicans are grandfathers to all of these different nations. Most of them are from the Algonquian ethno-linguistic group. There's two sort of big ethno-linguistic groups, the Algonquian and the Iroquoian. The Mohawks are Iroquoian. Algonquian, the peoples in New England, the Delaware, the Mohicans are Algonquian. The peoples around the Great Lakes are also mostly Algonquian, and these are two sort of ethno-linguistic groups. It's kind of like, the difference between the Germanic and like Arabic-speaking peoples. Very different kinds of languages, but two different language families, and some cultural differences that follow from that. So one of the big differences between the Mohicans and the Mohawks and other Iroquois is this language difference. They don't speak anything like the same language, whereas the Mohican language is very similar to the language of the Munsee, Delaware, who live in the Hudson Valley, or with the peoples in New England. So they were much friendlier with them because it was a lot easier to talk to them. This whole system of kinship, I argue, and I believe, is not some ancient traditional thing with Native Americans, but it's something that comes out of the constitution, basically, of the Iroquois Confederacy. This confederacy that joined together first 5 nations and then 6 nations as a sort of alliance. But what gets lost is that it also ended up including other people, non-Iroquoian peoples, like the Mohicans and the Delawares, in this Confederacy alliance, but in a different way from the ways like the Mohawks and the Oneidas and Cayugas were all part of it. But the kinship language is all about describing their different relationships to each other and their different, the nature of their connection to each other and to the Confederacy. And it did not exist earlier in the 17th century, when the Mohicans were independent, and they were often at war with the Haudenosaunee. On and off, I'm not sure how much you know about this, but they've been neighbors for centuries before the Europeans show up. We don't know a lot about that history, but they've been on and off at war before then, and then that gets even worse once the Dutch show up, because they set up their main trading post in Albany, which is at the core of Mohican territory, so that gives Mohicans good access to the trade. but the Mohawks had good access to the furs, so they fight a war, the Mohawk-Mohican War in the 1620s. The Mohicans lose, and then for the next couple of decades, they're mostly at peace with the Iroquois Confederacy. But then in the 1660s, they join with their Algonquian neighbors, in the Delaware to the south and all the people of New England, in a massive alliance that fights a really big war that nobody's written a book on this war. It should have its own book, but that tried to basically stop the Iroquois Confederacy in its track. It had been growing and expanding to the north and the west, attacking and destroying and incorporating different nations. And then in the 1660s, this amazing alliance united all of these peoples from Maine and New Brunswick down to Pennsylvania, with the Mohicans kind of in the middle of it all, to try and stop basically the expansion of the Iroquois Confederacy. And a turning point for the Mohicans, I think, was in 1664. It took place over in the Connecticut River Valley at the village of Pecumtuck, which is a different nation but close friends with the Mohicans. It's at the site of today's Deerfield. And the Mohawks had sent an embassy there to secure peace and the submission of the Pecumtucks basically to the Iroquois Confederacy. And rather than accept it, Pecumtucks killed the emissaries, started a war with the Mohawks, which ended up destroying the village of Pecumtuck, but that also pulled the Mohicans back into this war, into the war with the Iroquois. So they're fighting this war with the Iroquois, and they're not winning. It's a very close thing, and it culminates in 1669 with this huge invasion of the Mohawk country. People don't know a whole lot about, but basically many of the New England nations, the Massachusetts and the Comtucks and others, together with the Mohicans, put together an army, and they invaded the Mohawk country. They almost captured the first Mohawk town. They don't, and then they retreat, and they're actually ambushed by the Mohawks just outside of Schenectady in a big battle where a number of people are killed, and then they all flee back to New England. But that event is important because we have evidence for it, and then in other evidence, I found out that just before that invasion happened, the Delaware peoples, so the Lenape, the peoples who lived in the lower half of the Hudson River Valley and west to the Delaware River Valley, are closely related. They've been friends and allies of the Mohicans. They were not part of that expedition because they had just made a peace with the Iroquois Confederacy. And at that peace treaty, which was sometime in the invasion happened in the summer of 1669, the peace treaty happened in the spring of 1669. Two important things happened. First of all, the Delaware, or the peoples who later become the Delaware, are incorporated into the Iroquois Confederacy with a new kinship term, which is cousins, or nieces and nephews. All these different words appear together in the sources at different times in translation, and basically they all refer to the same kinship status. And at the same time, that meant that the Iroquois were the uncle of the Delaware. Figuring out what that meant really was the eureka moment for me in this whole project, because, we have ideas about what an uncle is, about what a father is, about what nieces and nephews are. But what we have to remember is that these people are matrilineal people. So they're not patriarchal or patrilineal like we are, where the most important authority figure in a family is the father, whether they actually are or not. But in theory, the father is, the principal authority figure. But in matrilineal families, the father is not that important a figure. The mother is the key figure, but then also the brothers of the mother are the key figures. The uncles are the key figure. So basically, in these matrilineal societies, the role of an uncle was much more. With the uncle was the person who had the power. They were the one who would discipline kids or tell them they couldn't do something or could do something. The father was just the fathers in these societies was more like an uncle in our Western patrilineal society, which is you're nice to the kids, you give them presents, you're friendly. And that's one of the big cultural differences between Native Americans and Europeans that led to a lot of confusion because when Native Americans think of a father, it's a very different figure from what Europeans think of. And the same goes for the role of uncle. But the role of uncle is actually a very powerful one, and it's one of authority and predominance over the people who their nieces and nephews or their cousins. There's the word that gets used kind of means all these things at the same time. And it's that kinship designation that gives them their place in the Confederacy. But it's a somewhat subordinate place. So they're not equals, they're not brothers, which is the word that the different Iroquois nations, the Oneidas and Onondagas and so forth, use to describe each other. They're cousins. The other thing is they give them a role of women. And this is a very controversial term in the aspect of the Delaware history, but they go through a whole ceremony of ritually putting on a dress on the Delaware. There's no actual women involved in this, but it's this symbolic role that they have as women, which is not what we think it is. There's been a lot of debate over the last couple hundred years over what exactly this meant. Did it mean that they were defeated or they were subordinate? That's not what the role of women did. Again, these are matrilineal societies, so women had an important role in ways that they don't in patrilineal societies. And they had a powerful role, including in diplomacy and war, because one of the ways that war parties or expeditions would be launched is when a woman who is a head of a clan or a head of a family lost somebody in her family, and she demanded that her children, her relatives or male relatives, go out and find someone and get revenge for that loss, basically, or find someone to take as a captive to replace the person who was lost. This is, scholars call this the mourning war tradition. So women didn't actually fight the battles, but they could tell men to go off and fight a war. But they could also stop them, and they could also say, that's enough, no more fighting, and they could also initiate peace talks. And that is what was meant when the Iroquois designated the Delaware as women, because they needed the Delaware to be their intermediaries with the former allies of the Delaware, including the Mohicans. And that's what we see over the next 100 years or so, is that the Iroquois Confederacy starts making peace with all of these different native nations around it. And often the Delaware were there first, kind of making the connection or bridging the negotiation. And that's really crucial, because in making peace, it's very hard to know who to trust. You didn't have a sort of a neutral UN kind of party or anything. But the Delaware end up taking that function. It doesn't mean they stop fighting wars at all, because they're the nieces, the nephews, or cousins of the Iroquois Confederacy. It means they also are their allies in war, and there's evidence that they did continue to fight wars, but as allies of the Iroquois against Iroquois enemies. But at the same time, they also began functioning as intermediaries, helping negotiate peace between the Iroquois and their many different enemies. And just sort of the short, answer here is that the elaborate kinship network that Hendrik Alpamat talks about in that history that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk is basically a reflection of those peace negotiations over time and who was involved and when they were involved and what the nature of those were, and the different kinship terms, whether it's brother or older brother or grandfather or uncle and so forth, all are about how these different nations are related to each other diplomatically. And the thing about the Mohicans is that, yes, they are grandfathers. Oh, and then the other thing, is that the combination of being the nephews or cousins of the Iroquois Confederacy gives them a position in the Confederacy, but then also the women in charge of negotiating these peace ultimately makes the Delaware nation grandfather to all the other nations in the Northeast and around the Great Lakes. And that this is because grandfather is a term for people who were powerful, benevolent figures, but they brought about peace. And in the Iroquois Haudenosaunee tradition, it was the grandfathers who created the Confederacy that brought about peace between the different nations. And so the person who takes on that role to other nations, as the Delaware did with all the other groups around them, including the Mohicans, they become grandfathers to that nation. And so the Mohicans, what's interesting about the Mohicans is they are grandfathers to many other nations, but there's only one nation in the whole world that that the Mohicans call grandfather, and that's the Delaware. At the same time, the Mohicans never have that designation as women that the Delaware had. That's something that only applies to the Delaware nation. And so this is really important for understanding what happens in the 1670s, sort of the focus of the talk, because after that big invasion in 1669 that I mentioned, which failed, the war continues for all the peoples east of the Hudson River. The peoples west of the Hudson River had just made peace, but the peoples east of the Hudson River were not party to that peace yet. So their allies across the river had basically abandoned them to make peace with the Iroquois. But it's a difficult war on both sides. The Iroquois are powerful, but they're not all powerful. They're kind of really fighting for their lives at this point. But also for the colonists, the people in Albany, the way they made a lot of their money was from the fur trade, and war was really bad for the fur trade because all the Native Americans are out fighting each other instead of hunting beaver for the trade. And so in 1671, we see the governors of the magistrates in Albany and the leading fur traders try and broker a peace between the Mohicans and the Mohawks. It just so happens that there were Mohawk delegates in town, and then they found out that there was a big party of Mohicans nearby hunting, not a diplomatic party, but hunters. And they invite them both to come together in Albany. They get together a bunch of wampum, which is this shell bead, shell beads that were really crucial for Native American diplomacy. You couldn't have you couldn't do diplomacy without it. Nothing counted. It's like a paper treaty for Westerners. And they pay for a feast, and they host a peace treaty between this Mohican hunting party and these Mohawk diplomats, which which is a start, but it's not an official peace because it wasn't a formally, the people from the Mohicans weren't delegated to do that, and the Mohawks were diplomats, but that they hadn't had the authorization to make that peace. So that peace needed to be confirmed. And until then, relations between the two were still very tense. There's occasional killings, and it looked like a war might break out again, like it has in the past. And for 4 years, there's a lot of efforts by the colonial governors in Connecticut and New York and Massachusetts to get all of the New England, the Algonquians, the Mohicans, and their neighbors to come together and make peace with the Haudenosaunee, and also to get the Haudenosaunee to make peace with them. And nobody trusts each other. Nobody's willing to take the first step. Fighting and killing is still going on. But then we see a turning point happens in February 1675, when a bunch of Mohicans show up in Albany and announce that they are now a confederacy. And for those of you, who know more about Mohican history, this is where the idea of a Mohican Confederacy comes from, because they say that they've all the Mohicans and the Catskills and all these different people have come together and they are now one nation. They came to Albany because this important colonist by the name of Jeremias van Rensselaer, who was a wealthy merchant and fur trader, who had also been very crucial to the diplomacy between all of these peoples, and he'd been one of the key figures that had organized that unofficial peace treaty a couple years earlier. He had just died, and the Mohicans are worried that the peace that had been made is going to fall apart. And they ask the magistrates of Albany for help. But the Albany magistrates aren't able to get their act together to kind of make the final peace treaty happen. But something happens between February 1675 and February 1676, because in February 1676, a year later, King Philip's War is on. New England is up in flames. The King Philip, or Metacomet, comes over to New York, and he's camped out with his people just a little north of Albany. He's trying to get supplies and guns and ammo. And they're living in Mohican territory, but the Mohicans don't help them out. Instead, they allow the Mohawks to attack them, and that drives them back into New England, back into the arms of the English, and that's basically the end of the war for them. They're pretty defeated, pretty devastatingly. And one of the reasons is because the Mohicans didn't help them. Instead, they sat still, is what the documents say. So why did they sit still, and what happened? Well, I think here is where the term so there's no documentary evidence for this. This is something that happened, off stage from the colonial record. And here's where the key piece of evidence for me is the term grandfather, and the fact that the Mohicans call the Delaware grandfather, and that's the only nation that the Mohicans refer to as Delaware as grandfather. And that's because the Delaware stepped in. The first group of people that they intervened with the Confederacy to make peace are the Mohicans, and they must have done it sometime in that year in between. So here I'm just sort of using all this evidence to kind of create and say that something happened, that otherwise we don't have any direct contemporary evidence, apart from the fact that, by 1676, the Mohicans are allies they're at peace with the Mohawks. They won't fight against the Mohawks. And then after that, you start seeing them refer to the Delaware as grandfathers. It takes a couple years before the peace really kind of congeals, but it works and it lasts. And actually, to this very day, these nations are still at peace. This is a lasting arrangement. And it's from that arrangement that then the Mohicans start to play a role as diplomats in negotiating peace between first the Shawnee in the Iroquois Confederacy, and then all of these other tribes. And that's where the Mohicans get their reputation as being a grandfather to all these other nations and setting up these different kinship relations, because that's all from their work in helping to bring peace between these different groups and the Iroquois Confederacy. The place we see that the most is the town of Scotticook. I'm not sure how many of you, this is in New York. It's just northeast of Albany. And that town began as a refugee center, basically, for New England native peoples who'd fought in King Philip's War and lost, mostly from the Connecticut Valley. So former friends and allies of the Mohicans who had gotten caught up in King Philip's War and lost, they came across the border and were allowed to settle in the town of Scotticook. And the Mohicans then mediate a peace between them and the Iroquois Confederacy. And then we see evidence that the Scotticooks start behaving like the Mohicans did, and they start saying that we're all part of the same nation, we're all part of the Mohican nation. They start calling the Iroquois their uncles. They even move to the Mohawk country for a while when there's the imperial wars break out between England and France. And so we can see, the people at the time writing down the documents didn't know what these kinship terms meant, but they recorded them. And once you do know what they meant, then the relations that are going on and what these people are talking about starts making a whole lot of sense. And basically all of that diplomatic world that Hendrik Alpamat talked about at the end of the 18th century, we can see it getting put together and being initiated in this peacemaking process in the 1670s. And so it's so this being incorporated into the Iroquois Confederacy gave peace to the Mohicans, but then also gave them this important diplomatic role that they were very proud of in future generations. Hendrik, they don't mention that a lot of that depended on the Iroquois or came from their connection to the Iroquois, nor did they really explain that it's really the Delaware who made it all possible in the first place. But we can see that in the term grandfather that they use, that they distinguish the Delaware with. That's the only native nation, the only nation of any sort that they call by that term. And so you can see how, looking through the different oral traditions to see how they talk about their past and their relations with each other, and then matching that with the different sources in the colonial records, these kinship terms, cousins, nephews, uncles, grandfathers, actually end up reflecting this sort of architecture of alliance that is created by the expansion of the Iroquois Confederacy and the Haudenosaunee, that starts with this history with the Mohicans in the late 17th century. So thanks. That's the end of the talk.
Thank you so much, Evan. That was wonderful. There's a lot of new information for me, I know, and I'm sure people have questions. And I just want to also remind you that our program director, Tracy Robinson, has put in a number of links that are in the chat box that you can go to, including a recording of Heather Brugel speaking about the Munsee band of Mohican Indians, the Stockbridge Munsees, that lived in our area specifically. And that's on our YouTube channel. David, would you like to say anything in terms of the talk, or?
Yeah, okay. I think what's really, really fascinating about Evan's talk is that he's trying to look at it through the Native American, the Indian eyes, the Indian nation eyes, rather than through European eyes. We have a tendency to present the Indians as passive in everything, and they were not passive. They were very much active in their own world, and it's fascinating to try to see how they view the events that are going on, not only among themselves, but how they're interpreting what's going on with Europeans. You see that, a lot of times people take it for granted, that the Europeans were taking advantage of them. But they also, in a lot of times, were believing they were taking advantage of the Europeans and manipulating them for their own needs. So it's interesting that Evan's trying to capture the reality that we're dealing with human beings who are very active and proactive in their own worlds. So I think it's a great talk, Evan.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So we have a lot of questions coming in for you, Evan. We have a question from Virginia, Evan, and that is, what drew you? This is a fascinating subject. What drew you to it?
I guess, well, David mentioned one of the books that I published. My first book was that book about Deerfield, the Captives and Captors book. And that kind of goes back to my senior thesis I did in college. I went to Hampshire College, just over the mountains there, which is near Deerfield. And I'd always heard about this thing called the Deerfield Massacre. When the French and Indians come and killed a bunch of New Englanders and took others captive. But by the end of my time in college, I realized that there's a lot of bad representations of Native Americans in our history and misunderstandings, and so I thought I would try and write a senior thesis, basically looking at the Deerfield Massacre, or what was called the Deerfield Massacre, to try and see if we can have a more sympathetic version of the Native role in all of that. And from that, I started getting into the Native American history of the whole northeastern region and seeing all of these connections, and then really trying to, I went to graduate school, became a colonial American historian, and like other books, part of what I write about is also religious toleration and coexistence, and that's kind of a separate interest, but also sort of related, because I'm really interested in how all these different peoples, the Dutch and the English and the French and the Iroquois and the Mohicans and Delaware, all these different groups coexisted. They fought wars with each other, but they also coexisted. It kind of helps because a lot of doing both of those interests at the same time, because a lot of the references to these oral traditions and evidence that I'm using to figure out this Native American version of this history, I'm finding in religious sources from like Moravian missionaries, for example, to Native Americans. So that's something that's not directly connected to the 17th century history, but it's connected to the descendants of the people who were involved. And because they talk a lot with the missionaries and the missionaries write this stuff down, that ends up being a big source of information. And then once you start getting into it, you just realize how little we know and how much more we need to know to understand how all of this stuff fits together. And I just have always been really fascinated, not just by bringing more justice to to the Native Americans and Native American history and our understanding of it, but in trying to figure out a way to write and approach history that actually can better account for the Native American experience. And that's where I get my interest in using the oral traditions. And what you see here in this talk is that they're actually really proving very powerful in helping me decode this whole complicated history that nobody's been able to figure out before.
Thank you. Do you have a sense of whether, when they use the term grandfather, they imply the maternal grandfather as opposed to fraternal, or is there no clear distinction?
That's a good question, and I do not know the answer. There is, I don't think there is a clear distinction. I'll just say a little bit more about the kinship stuff. The way this works from, these are from historical sources and some oral traditions and anthropological work. It's a bunch of different studies, but basically people were closely related, and they basically considered um, uh, almost everybody to be their children. They didn't. The term. This is why the terms cousin, niece, nephew, and like I said, that's one. That's kind of one word um, that gets translated in all three ways. Um, by different translators in the colonial period, but it basically means the same thing. It's one um, kinship position, and it is to describe um, the children um, of your the ego, sort of the children of your sister, um, the people to whom you are an uncle, um, which is not most of the people in the village that you're living with. But what's really interesting is all the other children in the village you would call your children and would be considered, the words they use, they were your children, your kids, as a man. Um, and so I think the grandfathers was sort of a generic term for the elders, the foreign, it wasn't like the literal grandfather actually living, your mother's dad or whatever living in your village, but it's sort of the previous generations, the ancestors in a way. And that, and like the term children was very generic, except for this one very specific definition of nephews, nieces, cousins. Um, and that suggested the basic equality, I think, that existed between all of these different people, except for the people who were, your nieces or your nephews, the closest relation. And I've been struggling to figure this out for years because it's very primal. We all have very specific ideas of what a mother is, or a father, or a nephew, or a child, and people did back then as well. And nobody ever explains it. Like nobody, not at the colonial records. They always use the terms. They say these people are our uncles. These people are our cousins, but they never explain what that means. Until finally, like a year and a half ago, I found an interview from the 20th century, where an anthropologist was interviewing I think it was a Seneca, as an Iroquois man, about the history of the Iroquois Confederacy, and he just sort of offhandedly mentioned the Mohicans and the fact that the Iroquois were uncles to the Mohicans. The Mohicans were their nephews, and he explained that that's like somebody that you kind of have tight control of, like a package under your arm. And that's when it all kind of clicked, because the children would kind of roam free and could do whatever, would do what they want. But your niece or your nephew, your sister's kid, that's the person that you had under control. That's the person you had authority over and responsibility for. And then once you kind of take that relationship and map it out onto all of these different kinship and relations between these different native nations, and then you connect it to the history that we know existed between these nations, all this stuff starts to really make sense. So that's just the that's what I see so far. The grandfathers is a very generic, and a lot of it is brothers is quite generic, but this uncle cousin, uncle nephew relationship is a very, very specific one and very rare. It's very rarely mentioned, and it's only mentioned in these cases of nations like the Mohicans or the Delaware, who were incorporated into the League, into this sort of subordinate allies.
Okay, thank you. Our next question: why would the governor of Virginia send a delegation to Albany in the late 1670s? Colonel Southey Littleton Southey, I think from Littleton, Virginia, September 16th, 1670, dies in Albany.
Because the Iroquois were attacking people living in Virginia. And then after this peace treaties that I mentioned with the Delaware and then the Mohicans, you actually have Mohican and Delaware warriors also joining the Iroquois in attacking the Native Americans down in what's now Maryland and Virginia. And Virginians and Maryland delegates come up a couple times. And we know this happens because they travel all the way up to Albany, because Albany is the place that the Iroquois Confederacy said, if you want to negotiate with us, that's where we meet. And so even the Virginians had to come up there to talk with them. And they complained that not just the Iroquois, but also Delaware and Mohican warriors were attacking their neighbor Indians.
All right, thank you. This is the next question. If languages were so differently developed, how did they communicate? Did they have translators?
Yes, they had people who knew the other language. Sometimes they were like war captives, or somebody, they were friends. Just two things really quickly. The word that the Mohawks use to characterize the Mohicans, in their own language, translates as stutterer. It's like somebody who can't speak the language right. And what's really interesting is with a bunch of different Native groups, the ways they talk about people who are, part of your nation and not part of your nation is whether or not they can speak your language or how well they can speak your language. So to be a stutterer is somebody who can, talk it a little bit, but isn't fluent, and it's not their natural language. And then in one of the sources that helped me pin down that 1669, the connection between the 1669 invasion of the Mohawk country and the first peace treaty with the Delaware that I mentioned, where the Delaware become women, get the designation of women, is from a letter from I was blanking on his name now. A Mohawk leader, famous Mohawk leader from the end of the 18th century, Joseph Brant. And I found it in the New York Historical Society archives when I was researching something about the history of religion in early New York. So something I wouldn't have found without my interest in religion. But he just writes a short note explaining that the Delaware weren't really women, they were nieces. He talks about the kinship term, and he says it happened around the time that the invasion of the Mohawk country happened. And then he tells a short little anecdote about what he calls a river Indian who was captured and killed by, sort of ritually executed by the Mohawks in this war. And I think it refers to something that probably happened in the early 1670s, and it's probably a Mohican, because when people said river Indian in New York in the 18th century, 9 times out of 10 they were talking about Mohicans. And it's said, and he was somebody who had grown up in that period of peace between the Mohawks and the Mohicans before the 1660s, because it says that he knew their language, and when warriors would get tortured to death, they would sing their death songs and chants. But the song and this is interesting because this happened, probably around 1670, and Joseph Brant wrote this note around 1800. So 130 years later, the Mohawks still remembered this one particular case where this Mohican who had formerly been their friend sang this death song where he talked about how they had been friends together, and in Mohawk language, that he knew Mohawk, and that they had been friends and they had traded furs together, but now they were enemies and they were killing him. It's just a brief mention, but very poignant. And I think the fact that was remembered for so long meant that it was really significant. And so that guy was probably a translator figure, an indigenous translator between the Mohicans and the Mohawks. So there were some people who knew at least, enough of the language to get by. they didn't in the Western Plains. They famously developed a sign language because there were so many different peoples and so many different languages. But in the Northeast, they didn't have that.
All right, thank you. And Don asks, from a populist perspective, the last of the Mohicans certainly captured the modern public's attention. What connections can be made, if any, from that film and actual history?
Well, the Mohicans are really upset by the title of the book because the last of the Mohicans suggests that there's no more Mohicans, and they're all about how we're still here and there's still plenty of us. So they really don't like that that version, that part of the story. But insofar as it can be a bit of a guidance, it is not entirely implausible because the Mohicans, as allies, as part of the Confederacy, were also allies with the British, and this is about them, a handful of them who work as allies of the British against the French in the 7 Years' War. So it's not, apart from the title, the basic premise of the story is not is okay.
Okay, now we know. And Timothy writes, thank you for the talk. Does your research have anything to say about the historical borders between the Mohawk and the other nations east of the Hudson? I'm asking as a resident of the northern Catskills of Greene County, who's been unable to tell the exact history of the land where I reside. Some sources say this area was mostly temporary hunting grounds. Other folk histories tell of eagle nesters, who were some combination of Dutch and Esopus and runaway slaves who lived in the mountains east of Catskills. Thanks in advance.
The first thing I would do is recommend the work of Shirley Dunn. She has done the kind of work you really need to do to figure out that kind of detailed stuff by going through all of the land deeds and land transactions going back to the beginning, the early purchases in the 17th century, to figure out which land was where and who sold it, and thus who was in control. And she has a couple books about the Mohicans where she talks a fair amount about that, and I think she's done the most work on that. Oh yes, you do probably have them in the library too, so I would definitely go to the library and check those out. She has 2 or 3 books. And Catskill, one of the Mohican, subgroups or village groups, was called the Catskills, and they lived, I think, right in your neighborhood, there on the north edge of the Catskills. And I've seen some stuff somewhere about more about their territory. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but Shirley Dunn would be the place to start. And I would think it's a fair bet that you're living in Catskill Mohican territory. That was theirs at least until the 18th century, when it was probably sold, and then these other people that you mentioned moved into the area.
Great. So Virginia has a question. How did you navigate all those languages? Do you speak them all?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I like languages, and so I spend a lot of time learning them, and that's one of the things that drew me to this particular kind of history, is that you get to use the languages, and you have to learn, you have to use the languages. And one of the reasons the story hasn't quite been told is because not many people know all of those languages together. So you only know English, you can only use the English sources. You only know French, you can only use the French sources. So you really need to grasp all these different languages to really tell the full dimensions of this history. And I'm doing some work also with Native American languages to understand these. That as well. It's a lot more difficult, obviously, but to figure out what the word, they didn't write things down in Mohawk language or Mohican in the 17th or 18th century. We only have the translations, but when they're translating some speech and they use the word cousin or nephew or niece, they weren't speaking English and they weren't using the English word. So I got to figure out what the native Mohican or Mohawk word was that they used for that. So that's also part of my work.
Okay, great. And we have some comments and question from Ruth Pawanka, who's an amazing local historian in our area. She said, "Nice to see Hampshire's great impact. My daughter went there as well. Ta-
Ah,
Taylor's history of Great Barrington, circa 1828 or a bit later, contains some fascinating information about the Stockbridge Indians that is somewhat unconventional. You read the Livingston Indian papers, which are minutes of sorts about the conferences that New York Indian commissioners held with different tribal members over many years." And one more short comment from her. "A goodly number of Dutch people living and farming at Kinderhook kept relationships with the Mohicans through circa 1770. It seemed they worked together fairly well."
yeah, thank you. I do know that that source, so that's one of the records that I'm using. That's a kind of a standard diplomatic source, sort of official colonial records. Um, and like that's where you have the evidence when I was talking about how the Virginians came up to Albany complaining that the Delaware and the Iroquois were attacking the native people down the Chesapeake. That's from the Livingston records. Um, but also, you see there, if you look at them, you'll see them talk about each other in using these kinship terms, um, and that's also an important source for that reason. Um, yeah, the Mohicans stayed in the area for quite a while. Um, they didn't really want to leave. I don't think they were very happy when they did have to leave. Um, uh, but yeah, it's a very interesting history, and they did manage to coexist for quite a long time. The Mohicans, another thing that the Mohicans are proud of, which is also kind of distinctive, is they were one of the first Native American groups in what's now the United States that became Christians or became Protestant Christians. And the Stockbridge Mission was a big part of that. There was a Moravian mission also, a little farther down in Connecticut, that to the Mohicans also in the 1740s. So that's another distinctive aspect of the Mohicans, and that was one part of their effort to, you know, stay on their land and maintain good relations with their European neighbors.
And Eric writes, "Were the terms mother or grandmother that we use among those used in the Mohicans and other kinship system?"
No, no, I've never seen that. One of the reasons people are so fascinated by this, when the Iroquois called the Delaware women, is because that's one of the only times you see a female gendered word used in diplomatic language. The other time is when they use the word niece, which, like I said, means niece, nephew, and cousin are all kind of mean the same thing, and they get used interchangeably to talk about the Delaware and the Mohicans. But apart from that, the public diplomacy, women played a role in the background, like I was saying, where they would, encourage men to go off to war or encourage men to stop fighting and make a peace, but they weren't there negotiating in public. Um, so it was all men talking to men, and with this weird exception of like the Delaware and the Mohicans, it was all male kinship terms that are used: brother, father, uncle, um, son.
Great, thank you. I have another comment from Ruth. "You can also read Moravian diaries about the Indian village at Pine Plains, which is very close to where we are, Evan. It is splendid. It is 2 volumes called Gideon's People." And, I think because people are giving us references, I'll take the text from this and pull the links and the references out of it also. So I don't know if you want to comment on that in particular.
No, I just thank you. You know, historians, we're always happy to have more sources and more references for it. I don't know. I'll just plug a book. Where is it? Um, this is a book that just came out that I read for a book review. Oh, it's all backwards on the screen. It's called Pacifist Prophet Papanhunk and the Quest for Peace in Early America. And this is about a Delaware who's a Moravian, but it's also about Mohican Moravians. So after that period that Ruth mentioned, some of them moved to Pennsylvania and lived in the late 18th century with this guy in Pennsylvania. So they talk more about it, and this is it's a biography of this Delaware man who's a religious leader, but also a diplomatic leader, and it's based a lot on Moravian German sources, which are very rich, and they talk a lot about diplomacy with the Iroquois and calling the Iroquois uncle, and the Iroquois call them cousins, and so there's a lot. The Moravian records have they don't really explain what it is, but it's the evidence. You can see it in the sources, and actually, there is one other interesting, really fascinating exception that I'll mention to the use of kinship terms and female kinship terms, and that is that the Delaware, when talking to each other, call each other sister. Delaware men, diplomatic men negotiating with each other. Everywhere else in America, when Native Americans or diplomats are negotiating with each other, they call each other brother generally, or uncle or something masculine. But the Delaware, when talking to each other, men talking to each other, use the word sister. And that is also a reflection of the special role as women, functioning as peacemakers within for or between the Iroquois Confederacy and the others. And it's used to denote that peaceful role. And the only really evidence we have that is from Moravian records, Moravian German records, because those missionaries were living with the Delaware and paid a lot of attention to what they knew their language and paid a lot of attention to what they said. You don't see that anywhere else. But that's another fascinating thing, and it's just there's something really exceptional about this history, and those unusual kinship terms are a reflection of that.
All right, thank you very much. We just got one more comment, I think, from Charles. Clearly, there is a revivalist agenda for the Mohicans and the Stockbridge Munsee now underway in New York State socio-politically. The pre-Confederacy, all right, how do I say this word, Evan? Kanenkehaka? Thank you. History has to be incorporated in this timeline better. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, the Mohawks, the Kanenkehaka.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So, and that's a good point. So I think we have a lot of thank yous and no more questions that I see. So, and I think there's a book or article titled something like "When the Delaware Became Women." I haven't read it to add anything about it. Do you know about that book, "When the Delaware Became Women"?
When the Delaware Became Women. Is that, well, I have an article that has that title. It hasn't been published yet.
Article.
It might be what that is.
Oh, okay.
But then, yeah, I don't know if you have the New England Quarterly, if that comes to your library, or if your patrons can get access to it. But from the September 2020 issue last year, I have an article that goes into a lot more detail about this whole Mohican history I was just talking about. So if people want to follow that, they can look that up.
Okay. Well, what I usually do, and first of all, thank you so much. This was wonderful, and we got a lot of thank yous and positive response. And thank you again, David, for the Leisler Institute collaboration. We always it adds so much to our local history series. What we usually do at the library is give, if it is being recorded, which this is, we'll send all the participants the recording link, and I'll also send. We had gathered a bunch of resources about the Stockbridge Muncie, so we can expand that list, and I'll send that also to all the participants. So thank you, and thank you everyone very much. This was wonderful. So thank you all. Have a good evening.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks for listening. I really appreciate your interest.